I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and to thank them very much for allowing us to all enjoy this beautiful area. And I'd also like to say how appropriate it is that the John Hume Institute for Global Irish Studies has actually established itself at University of New South Wales. I actually was a colleague of Professor Patrick O'Farrell some years ago, and I still remember as a young historian, he was on the selection committee, and I still remember coming to University of New South Wales from Melbourne and fronting up to this very scary, huge committee for a tenured job. And the person I was most terrified of was definitely Patrick O'Farrell, because he had a terribly furrowed brow and frowned sternly at absolutely everything I said. And so afterwards I sort of said, who was he? And people said, that was Patrick O'Farrell. And I said, oh, I think he really hated me. And they said, no, he's like that all the time with everybody. And, and fortunately I found he actually did like me and I got the job. But I also have many fond memories of him. I remember once a book that I wrote was shortlisted for a very prestigious award, and I was absolutely thrilled because it was my first book to be shortlisted. And then I didn't actually win the prize. And Patrick was great. He sort of said, you should have won it. The other book was drivel. And I've always thought back on that and thought, how encouraging was that? He also set up the community history program. Now that was really something, taking history skills out into local communities in the country. And I went on a couple of them with him, and the people in the country, towns like Parkes and so on, were so honoured to have this professor from University of New South Wales who'd gone to the trouble of helping them write their histories. They wanted to write local histories and family histories. So he always believed that history should reach a wider audience, and so he would have loved this event tonight because he didn't believe that it should be confined to academe. Of course, he also gave very inspiring lectures and seminars, so I can't promise to match his wonderful style that he had. So to the lecture. For many years now, Irish Australians have been returning to Ireland to find their family roots. While yearning for ancestral stories may be a common human trait, descendants of New World immigrants have turned the quest for Irish relatives into a favourite hobby. As if the roots of Irish-born Australians have not sunk deeply enough into this settling soil, they seek a sense of belonging from more ancient histories with deeper connections to place. Indeed, it is as if, designed to satisfy such history tourists, the whole of Ireland has been declared a heritage site. Not only does it have the right kind of stone walls everywhere, beautiful hedges and matching house styles, but if you go into a church, it has the same statues of the Virgin Mary and St. Therese of Lisieux that we grew up with, those of us who went to the Catholic schools and churches anyway. And they also have heritage priests, because I went into a church that I was quite excited about because my great-grandfather had been married there, and I went in. The taxi driver actually told me that was the church he would have gone to, and he was shouting out at the audience, all the parishioners about fire and brimstone, and they'd all go to hell and how everything was bad. And I thought, whoa, that's just like what it was when I went to school. And also, if you try an Irish doctor and ask for a prescription of the pill, you will find that they will definitely not give it to you quite often, until, of course, the female pharmacist tells them off and they sheepishly apologise, whimpering and pleading for forgiveness. So I thought this was sort of interesting, this female-male dynamic that's still very interesting, with the matriarchs taking on the senior men still in Irish society. But more surprising perhaps, for a range of reasons, Aboriginal people of Irish descent are also making reverse journeys to Ireland. This is, of course, a global story, one of diaspora, one of multiple directions. For many, Irish Australian journeys provide opportunities for a more introspective, familial or ancestrally connected kind of identity tourism. As demonstrated by Oliver McDonagh, who wrote The Sharing of the Green, A Modern Irish History for Australians, the concept of diaspora allows for more than one homeland. Now, how many places would have a special history written for them of Ireland, a history of Ireland for Australians? I find that most interesting. Oh, perhaps that book comes up a bit later, the cover of that book. So, as I said, many Australians of Aboriginal descent are now starting to travel to Ireland, engage with Ireland, and they're also publicly identifying as Irish. And I think that some of them are actually invited there to Celtic festivals. And I must say, I know the debates about Celtic and Celtic, but I think you're more used to saying Celtic. And I found that they not only went to the Celtic festivals in Ireland, but were also asked to ones in Brittany. And they've been asked to play the didgeridoo and get involved in all these things, as though the people celebrating the Celts actually want to include Aboriginal Australians in these festivities. And when I went to Ireland in 2007, I went to the County Clare Museum in Ennis. And I was quite amazed there to find that when you went into the museum, one of the first things you saw was an Australian Aboriginal art exhibition. And then when you went into the museum, there was an exhibition about the history of migration and also the migration of those Irish immigrants who went back to Ireland too was very much part of the story. And then I found out that in 1990, during quite an early phase of the commercial Aboriginal art movement, Kathleen and Tamari Petiare travelled to Dublin to open an exhibition of Aboriginal art at the Royal Hibernian Academy. So Ireland was a bit ahead of the game here too in recognising Aboriginal art. The significant Robert Holmes a Court collection of batik, entitled Utopia, a picture story, was also exhibited in Limerick and Cork. And this was before Emily Kangware became famous for her beautiful massive canvases. This was the batik that preceded this. Historian Bob Rees was at this event, and he described the Gaelic poetry readings as promoting, quote, a natural, indeed a primeval cultural bond between Irish and Australian Indigenous peoples, what he called a Hiberno-Australian indigenality. He hasn't taken off that term. That's right. Whatever the different players make of such travels and exchanges, this Aboriginal Australian and Irish nexus is starting to reroute the old migration and historical itineraries. So this lecture will consider some aspects of the history of Irish immigrants to Australia in relation to Australian Aborigines, but it is, of course, a big topic. But part of the topic is that Irish Australians have sometimes been portrayed as the good colonisers or the more benevolent colonisers towards Aboriginal people. So the title, For Better or For Worse, is a play upon both marriage and the marriage that takes place under colonialism, where two peoples or many peoples end up sharing the same sky roof and the same space. And unlike a heterosexual marriage, however, I'm not sure if this is going to be sustained, but there's less clarity, I'd say, in the colonial contract than there is in the marital contract. I mean, who does owe who what has never been very clearly articulated in Australia because there were no treaties. So it might be rather hard to even think of, well, what is benign colonialism in a place like Australia? So yet this is a vital part of the history of Irish immigrants in Australia, that is their relation to Australia's First People. Surely it is quite an important topic. We know that Irish men and women formed unions and started families with Aboriginal men and women. But as I pointed out in a recent article in Aboriginal History, which some of you may be familiar, research into this topic is very limited indeed. No systematic study of the long history of intermarriage with Aboriginal people has been conducted in Australia, unlike in New Zealand, where Angela Wanhalla has started a big demographic survey across the whole of New Zealand. Mark Hanna has done some study of Queensland and has tabulated some statistics there, but most of his work remains in a thesis, unpublished. So after all, the very discussion of mixed marriages between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians has been a little bit of a whispered secret that hasn't been tackled by anybody, let alone academics. And after all, the meaning of the term mixed marriage used to be about marriages between Protestants and Catholics. It was almost like you couldn't imagine another equation. And we shouldn't forget the fact that the children of Irish fathers and Aboriginal mothers often ended up being the stolen children, removed from both father and mother, with all the associated trauma and suffering that this entailed. There were Irish mothers too, as Vicky Haskins and John Maynard have started to research, though the children of the Irish mothers do not seem to have suffered the same degree of child removal of their families. In January 2009, commentator Andrew Bolt, you might have heard of him, used Mick Dodson's Irish ancestry to question his assertions of an Aboriginal identity. Dodson was then Australian of the Year, it was 2009. And the authenticity narrative belies the history of sexual relations and intermarriage in which white Australians, including Irish, were rather obviously implicated. It seems that some Aboriginal Australians have started to articulate intermarriage also as part of their survival story, and some of them say that consciously they intermarried in order to survive as a group. In August 2009, the Irish Echo published a list of the top 100 Irish Australians. This, of course, included bushranger Ned Kelly and the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, Aboriginal singer Kev Carmody, and Aboriginal athlete Patrick Johnson. So in this case, the Irish Australians are quite proud of these links, and Paul Keating, of course, is up there. So what do Aboriginal people think? In New South Wales, Morree's rugby club that plays in the Aboriginal rugby knockout is actually called the Shamrock Aboriginal Warriors. And it must be something to do with the Irish because they wear green, white and a shamrock emblem. Earlier clues that Aboriginal people may have adopted the shamrock include an 1890s nulla nulla with a shamrock carving that's in the Australian Museum in Sydney. But we can't be sure about its Irishness because apparently there is another plant that's a little bit like the shamrock, which is a native to Australia. So it'd be interesting to do more research to look into that. So what about the prominent Australian Aboriginal people who've identified as Aboriginal Irish? My website survey of some contemporary Aboriginal identities reveals several high achievers. Artist Kevin Dolman, a member of Artists in Black, described himself as Aboriginal Irish Australian on his website. He says his mother is from the Eastern Arrernte people of Central Australia near Alice Springs, and his father is an Irish immigrant from Derry in Northern Ireland. Singer and songwriter Kev Carmody has a website where he explains that he grew up on a cattle station near Goranba, 70 kilometres west of Dalby in Queensland. The family, although poor and despised by the local white community because of their mixed marriage, his father, he says, was mad Irish, fighting Irish, and his mother, a Murray, lived largely off the land growing vegetables near the house and hunting and catching everything from kangaroos to fish. I love that description because it sounds like a bit of a traditional Irish subsistence combined with an Indigenous economy. In 1956, when he was 10, Carmody was taken from his parents and sent to a Christian school, which he had described as little more than an orphanage. Both his Irish father and Murray mother came from powerful oral traditions. Carmody still talks about the stories and songs he was told and taught by his Murray grandparents and his extended Murray family. He therefore stresses that he as a songwriter is very much inspired by both Irish and Murray oral history traditions converging. Canberra-based Indigenous poet Jennifer Martinello celebrates her Chinese and Irish as well as Arrernte background. Her granddaughter absolutely loves Irish dancing and she's very proud of her and she says it's in her blood. That's why she's so good at it. The website entry for Patrick Johnson, who's you may not know is the fastest white man, even though he's Aboriginal. Race can be quite fluid, especially if somebody's a sports star, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. He's very proudly Aboriginal Irish, and his mother was from Yarrabah, who died in a car accident, so he was brought up by his Irish father. Kyle van der Kuyp, who's a good friend of his, also an athlete, is very proud of his Aboriginal identity, but he says as an athlete he feels he's always being targeted for press because he's Aboriginal. He said, but I'm actually Aboriginal Irish. Why isn't anyone coming up to me asking me about the Irish? So a lot of people who see themselves as of dual background get annoyed by journalists only seeing them as one. Indigenous Irish identity has been deployed also to explain injustice. It was used to make some sense of the plight of Dawn Casey, founding director of the National Museum of Australia. Although one government-appointed external review panel said that she was an absolutely amazing manager and director, she still had her contract cancelled, and she was generally seen as being too sympathetic to the black armband view of history. Now, knowing Dawn and working at the museum at the time, I'll say that was really far from the case. But at her farewell, Professor Mick Dodson blamed racism. At a very angry farewell speech, it was reported this: an emotional Professor Dodson, who heads the Australian National University's Indigenous Studies Unit, referred to their shared Aboriginal Irish heritage. He described Miss Casey as an inclusive director who embodied the spirit of Aboriginal womanhood and centuries of Irish struggle. Perhaps if you were white and had a dick and were of Anglo descent, you would have been treated with greater decency, Professor Dodson said candidly. But then again, the Anglos haven't been about treating blacks or Irish with any decency. Professor Dodson's tribute was actually choked by emotion and interrupted by tears. Indigenous historian Wayne Atkinson suggested numerous notable people who were not on my list when I gave a paper about this in Galway. He mentioned John Moriarty, painter of the Qantas Plains, the father of reconciliation, Pat Dodson, the mother of reconciliation, arguably Lois O'Donoghue, who was removed from her family when quite young. So the self-identified category of Aboriginal Irish in Australia is becoming a familiar one. And of course there are German Aboriginal people, but you rarely hear of people saying I'm Aboriginal English or I'm Aboriginal Welsh or Aboriginal Scots. Some of these Shamrock Aborigines have been famous political activists: Jack and Joe McGuinness and the highly articulate Gary Foley. The McGuinnesses were prominent leaders in Darwin and nationally, arguing against restrictions on Aboriginal rights and arguing for citizenship. They helped propel the famous Goringi walk-off at Wave Hill, and that's quite iconic in both land rights and equal wages campaigns. In 1967, McGuinness was the president of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and Joe was influential in the referendum movement that fought for citizenship for Aboriginal Australians. Val and Vi McGuinness proudly continued the fighting spirit that they identified as Irish. Val stated that his father was born on a Dublin ship in New York Harbour, so a global story again. Cheryl Buchanan, Lionel Fogarty, many of the activists in the Tent Embassy actually were Irish background. And they often talked about this phenomenon of the fighting Irish that helped give them a great pride in their own identity as Irish and as Aboriginal, and who gave them the courage. And you may not understand why it took so much courage for Aboriginal people to protest about these rights, but in fact they could be thrown onto a castle reserve 1,000 kilometres from their family. They could be jailed. They're quite serious consequences often in Queensland, for example, when Aboriginal people spoke out. In 1987, in the lead up to the bicentenary, Burnham, who you might remember, planted a flag on the white cliffs of Dover and said, "We Aborigines are taking over England." Got a lot of good publicity. But he actually lambasted other Aborigines in Australia, saying the Shamrock Aborigines have got too much Irish anger and they should become more spiritual. On the other hand, John Maynard recently was telling me that his auntie told him that in his family, who were strong unionists and wharfies, that the Irish and the Aboriginal was pretty deadly, a lethal combination, she said to him. So what, however, is the explanation for this increasingly open recognition of Irish and Aboriginal roots? In his influential tome, The Irish in Australia, which I showed before, the front cover of, Patrick O'Farrell argued that the assimilationist tendencies of the Irish in Australia set them apart from Irish immigrants elsewhere. Unlike the Irish in the United States, for example, they did not form ethnic enclaves. And he said that this was due to their intermarriage with the Scots, English and Welsh. But he took it further than that. He said that on the subject of Irish Aboriginal interactions, that relations between the Irish and Aborigines were generally of the kind indicated by the Aboriginal writer Faith Bandler, recalling her childhood in northern New South Wales. In contrast to Protestant paternalist or exploitative whites, Irish Catholics treated the Aborigines as human beings, as equals. Bandler, however, was not Aboriginal, and she actually wrote a book about her story because her father was a Pacific Islander. Although O'Farrell placed his own comments about this Irish intermarriage in parentheses, he went on further to extend his intermarriage hypothesis beyond British integration. He daringly argued that the Irish were not as sexually exploitative as other ethnic groups. The Irish viewed Aborigines, he says, quote, with an equality extending to marriage, as distinct from the sexual exploitation common in white relations with Aborigines. The Shamrock Aboriginal names prominent amongst contemporary Aboriginal activists testifies to this relationship. In other words, the Irish, he's arguing, were the group most likely to cohabit, acknowledge and to rear children with Aboriginal women. But what is his evidence? It's difficult to know whether this is just wishful thinking, whether he knows this from wide reading in the field. Sometimes historians do get quite a good hunch about things by their wide, deep knowledge. But he doesn't offer any evidence, really, other than this surnames thing. Now, Aboriginal people traditionally didn't have surnames. They didn't have English names, obviously. And these names were often given to them just for record keeping by the for colonial reasons. So when a policeman had the job of writing down Aboriginal people's names in a register or registering them for the free blanket or the free rations or something, or just to get a census, they would have to have a name. And so often the names were given for quite different reasons other than paternity. They might be given because the policeman, they just go, okay, well, your name's Dolan, I'll have the name Dolan. So they just took a name from the policeman registering them, or they took a name from the pastoralist who employed them, or the cattle station where they worked. On the other hand, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the names they had actually were the names of the fathers, but you wouldn't, because often it was the pastoralist or it was the local policeman who was Irish. However, short of DNA testing, you're not going to get evidence on this because people rarely wrote down this. It was a secret because of the social ostracism of mixed marriage, but also it was illegal in Queensland. It was illegal to cohabit with an Aboriginal woman if you weren't Aboriginal in Queensland, Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and you had to seek permission to marry, if you lived without being married, you'd be jailed or fined, and if you actually sought permission, that would be a wonderful way of outing the issue, and then you might go straight to jail. So it was quite a quandary whether you should try to seek marriage. Usually when people had already gone to jail, they tried to then get married because once they got out of jail, they wanted to go back to their wife. Of course, the other equation in all this is that Aboriginal families and Aboriginal women didn't necessarily believe in this concept of the Western Christian or registered style marriage under colonial state law or national law. So this moral priority that Patrick's given to marrying them may not be culturally shared as a value. So basically, I don't think he's really offering much evidence, but at the same time, his views have been incredibly influential because his books are really the most influential on the history of the Irish in Australia. So there are arguments against, like there's plenty of evidence that the croppies, as the poorer Irish were called, were often very cruel to Aboriginal employees. Amongst the convicts, the Irish were often terrified of Aborigines. They were ignorant, they feared them, they often needed their tools, so they go and rob them of their tomahawks, and then naturally enough, Aboriginal people would be after them. Or they would be stealing the women because of the gender imbalance. The Irish convicts might be quite keen to get an Aboriginal woman, and so then there'd be retaliation. So there is the sort of happy working class idea that, maybe because they were all more, not middle class or uppity, that they might get on better with the Aborigines. Well, that sometimes might have happened. They might have needed to collaborate in order to survive, and maybe they needed to get on well with Aborigines in some places in order to find food or to work together. But there hasn't been the level of local study done to really tell the story reliably. And I think it would have happened differently in lots of different localities and, of course, in different eras of the frontier and frontier settlement. So while there certainly would have been some cooperation and some love matches and families across frontier, there were also some more disturbing stories. For example, Alexander Crawford, who was a pastoralist who had a station in the Murchison district, and that's a photo of him and his family there, is included in another book by Patrick O'Farrell, Letters from Irish Australia. And rather disturbingly, O'Farrell calls this group of letters love story because Alexander Crawford is trying to woo his cousin who lives in a different part of, who lives in Victoria. But he also has Irish relatives back home, like his father, I think, is still at home. So he was neither egalitarian nor likely to marry an Aboriginal woman. He was known for not allowing his white workers to live with Aboriginal women, and therefore they found him cruel because of this, because apparently it was quite common at the time in the 1880s. Crawford was certainly involved in violent captures and cruelties towards Aboriginal men who killed his sheep. And in 1883, Aboriginal people nearly killed him in retaliation. His family back in Ireland were appalled, not because he was nearly killed, but because he went on a murdering rampage afterwards. They foresaw great trouble, and his father warned him in a charming style, and I should have got Paddy to read this in good, a good accent, but he says, "I hope you are getting on with the natives better. Your Aunt Mattie says kindness goes far with them. Probably if you tried some of this, you might do better. But I'm sure you are kind naturally, yet you are too much inclined to drive men more than lead. but most likely your views on this point have been modified before now. My mother used to say, never use the broken reed if love will do the deed. Letters from Lily Matthews, who was his fiancée, his hoped-for fiancée, also ridiculed him for not learning enough of the local Aboriginal language to be properly understood by them. Another violent skirmish on the property actually thwarted his marriage plans. And with Crawford still seeking vengeance against Aborigines for taking his sheep, Lily wrote on Sunday to admonish him, "It's a dreadful thing to be continually hunting down one's fellow creatures, for they are our fellow creatures and have precious and immortal souls. Oh, my darling, keep your hands free from your fellow creatures' blood. For you to need to fire on them makes me feel miserable. It seems dreadful when really in your heart you cannot blame them for taking the sheep. They don't know right from wrong." And then she goes on to say, "Oh, I understand how you might see them as little more than beasts, but they're not. They have souls. Oh, my darling, keep yourself free from any stain of these poor creatures." So what comes out in these letters to me is they didn't seem worried at all about him getting murdered by the Aboriginal people. They seemed far more worried about him murdering them and them all going to hell together because of the stain. You know, it seemed to be they thought the whole family would be stained by this terrible deed that he was doing. So the Catholic Irish also suffered racism, and they were often drawn, as you can see in this image, this is an Irish working woman, and they were drawn with these supposedly negroid features, and they were sometimes compared with orangutans and chimpanzees. And also they were compared with Aborigines, and they were said to be not nearly as superior or as intelligent as Aboriginal Australians were. So there was racism against the Irish as primitive, backward, as not fitting in with the modern world at all. But in recent studies by historians, there seems to be this collapse of the Irish are always talked about as part of this fused group called the Anglo-Celts, or they're talking about as whites. And it seems that people have forgotten that in fact the Irish were viewed as black, or they were viewed as somehow inferior to Aboriginal people. So that's what I meant before about this malleability of race. And there's an American author who's written a book about the Irish in America called How the Irish Became White. And in fact, I think in 1901, Alfred Deakin made a speech about white Australia, and he actually said that in Australia, he thought everybody should be able to marry without degradation, and therefore we would be a homogenous society. So I think really what he meant was we should intermarry across the Anglos and the Celts and the Welsh at the time. He definitely didn't mean we should marry Aboriginal people as well. But at the same time, the Irish have had quite an ambiguous role in the whole colonising project, because they've been colonised by Ireland, by the British, but here they are, historically not wanting to really recognise that they were colonisers too. They would rather see themselves as exiles. And in fact, one of the first Australian musicals was called The Exile, and it was an Irish musical. And that's the music from it. And also, when it came to helping the Irish back home, the Hibernian society sometimes had a bit of an ambivalent attitude, and they sometimes didn't want to be seen as Irish, as they thought to get ahead in the system, it's better if we don't speak our own language, it's better if we don't act Irish and just blend in with the rest. There are some lovely stories of the Irish who lived close to Aboriginal people, and you could see that some of them were pretty dodgy characters who used their Irishness to advantage. And one of these was Mick Sharkey, who was a cook in the Victoria River District in the Northern Territory. And he apparently was trying to make money out of dingo scalps, but he thought the easiest way to do it would be just to kill the local Aboriginal people's dogs. So they got so angry at him, they threatened to kill him. They all lined up with clubs to kill him. And apparently he sort of thought, whoops, and what'll I do? And so he started weeping and crying and saying how he missed his homeland. And apparently the Aboriginal people went, oh, we get that. And they then reportedly went and helped him find some useless dogs and see if they could get some money out of it too, or so the story goes. So Patrick O'Farrell's book, The Irish in Australia, was actually launched by Bob Hawke. The Labor Party has had a big interest in this Irish working class history. We had like Ian Turner and the radical historians of the 60s and 70s talked a lot about the white men of Australia and the wonderful working man's history. But they too conflated the Irish were part of the whites, and they didn't distinguish the Irish as in America, where it's got quite a separate history. So I just wanted to show you this. This is Bob Hawke launched Patrick O'Farrell's book because he was the Prime Minister at the time, and this was, I think it says something recognising the importance of Irish history in Australia to have the Prime Minister launch it. But as you see, he's really taken up a lot of that page there. And so Patrick O'Farrell had a lot of trouble trying to fit his name in, even though he was the author. So what of the children? We don't really know there's no separate story of the Irish stolen children. We really don't know enough about this, and I really think we need to do a lot more research. We're all familiar with the whole story of the stolen children since the Bringing Them Home report, the apology with Kevin Rudd, and of course it was Paul Keating who made the Redfern speech to recognise many of these wrongs, and of course he also went to Ireland and visited the home of Chifley and Ned Kelly's ancestors and his own ancestors, and Bankstown, where he came from, used to be called Irishtown too. So the Labor Party has had this interest in Irishness and Irish anti-authoritarianism against the British. So, since the 1990s, the Irish Catholics have also shown an interest in rights movements, and I remember up in Kensington, the sisters up there had a Women for Wick festival where they invited singers to sing about their own experiences with stolen children, and so there's been quite a lot of action from the Catholic left about some of these social justice issues relating to Aborigines. Of course, I can't really give any lecture about the Irish in Australia without mentioning Ned Kelly. Now, you may think that I've just thrown this in, but in fact, I've got some interesting theories about Ned, which would really take another lecture to expand. But we did this exhibition at the National Museum of Australia, and it was with all this history wars going on. Jim Murphy, who's now passed away, had this idea of having a big exhibition about the Irish. And it was interesting how at that time, in the middle of the history wars, that seemed like a comforting return to white history, good old white history. And yet that is so not. The tradition of the Irish history has been of radical history. So I just sort of want to point out this change, the way it's, there's this interesting tension here. The Irish as the outlaw, the Irish as the one who is refusing to take any notice of authority or the government, the Irish hero epitomised in Sidney Nolan. And then you have these, there's a school called St Bridget's in Victoria, and it was going to be sold. The Catholic Church was going to sell it. And so in Eureka Street, they asked Archie Roach to come and sing. Now, Archie Roach is not of Irish descent. He's an Aboriginal man from the same region as the church, but he agreed to sing because of this idea that we've all been oppressed in this country together. They were famine immigrants, and Archie Roach was keen to give his imprimatur to this event, and St Bridget's was saved. So, but it was all very much about the Irish history that they were promoting. As for doing this better research about the Irish, I've already come into some strife myself. I'm thinking, well, Bill Harney, he must be Irish. He's one of the few white people in the Northern Territory who's very well known who admitted to openly. He was married to an Aboriginal woman, he had children with them. He was quite an entrepreneur in opening up Ayers Rock and all this type of thing. He also didn't recognise a lot of his children, including one son called Bill Harney, so he wasn't going to get away with not recognising him. And he's become quite an important knowledge holder. But I just assumed, because the Aboriginal people called him Billani, and I thought he was Irish, but according to the Australian Dictionary biography, his parents were from London. So you think, well, how do you work out who's Irish and who's not? Or if you're looking at massacres, how do you work out, was that a massacre by an Aboriginal, by an Irish man? Or it's very complex to just work out who is Irish, who isn't, because Bill Arney's parents might have been Irish Londoners. There's often dual identity. So that was the Irish school that I went to, All Hallows, which has now become quite snobby in Brisbane. And that was, yes, the glory of standing near the Kelly armour. Kate Kelly, of course. But basically what I was wanting to get to was this, the Aboriginal presence in the Kelly story. This is supposed to be an image of the Victorian police with the Kelly gang looking at them while they're having fun and drinking, and have an Aboriginal woman there in the picture. And it's sort of mocking the Victorian police. And then you hear that Ned, in fact, was only afraid of the black trackers, and it was the black trackers who found him. He called them black devils. He knew how much skill they had and how much knowledge of how to track and how to find him, and they found him. They were brought from Queensland. There were Victorians as well, but most of them were brought from Queensland. And in that photo, the Queensland Inspector of Police is there as well, and the Kelly gang. There's also how did Ned and his gang know how to live in the bush for so long and evade everybody? They actually built things, they knew how to build meres. And I have found a bit of a link with Ned as a child learning from Indigenous people in one of the towns he lived in. But there needs to be a lot more research on that. Of course, Aboriginal people have their own Indigenous stories about Ned, and in the Victoria River District, which of course is the famous place where the Gough Whitlam handed back the land to Vincent Lingiari, in that district they argue that Ned was born in their country, he was Indigenous, and that he rose up in the sky and he went to England and they murdered him in England. And they also argue that the Irish who came to their country travelled the right way, and Captain Cook and the English travelled the wrong way, the bad way. So there's this idea of the Irish being the moral colonisers in at least the Gurindji's stories. And I certainly know about the difficulties of identifying the Irish even in my own family, because we always thought of ourselves as Irish through and through, Irish Australians, and I just always assumed that was right. And then I sort of went, oh, actually, my grandfather was English, my great-grandmother was from Birmingham, and okay, there are Clancys and there are Eagans, they were from Scotland, the Eagans, they were Scottish-Irish, and you know, you sort of add it all up, you're going, actually, they were very intermarried, and they weren't even all Catholic, which is another shock horror, you know. So we had actually adopted a preferred identity, as I think a lot of white Australians prefer to identify with Irish because of its anti-authoritarian, Labor tradition, defiant tradition. And I think the same kind of thing might be an explanation for why a lot of Aboriginal people are more proud to identify as Irish, because of this common history of protest and fighting authority, and the common history of oppression. Now, if you want to compare longevity in one place, the Aboriginal Australians beat the Irish, hands down, 50,000 years, a lot more than 8,000. However, when it comes to fighting the oppression of the British, the Irish do win. There have been more centuries of fighting the English in Ireland than there has yet been in Australia. And yet, I think that a lot of Aboriginal Australians draw inspiration from this. Certainly, I wanted to show you, this is Cardinal Moran, And again, an image from Patrick O'Farrell's book about Through Irish Eyes, Irish in Photographs. He actually said, look at the Irish understood the exploited, those driven from land, those exploited and despised. He uses exploited twice in the same sentence. So he was clearly very passionate about this. But once again, with no real evidence, and this may not be an Aboriginal child. It might, in fact, be a Pacific Islander child. If you look at the people in the background, they might be islanders. We don't know. We don't know enough about it. Pat Dodson went on a trip in the 1990s to Ireland, and it's very interesting because he was invited to go and speak about reconciliation. He sat down with a boy on the streets who'd been brought up to hate the Catholics. And he sat down and said, I used to be a Jesuit priest before I got booted out of the church. And they sat down together and they found common ground. And I thought that was a very moving story, that it takes an Aboriginal Australian to go over there and create this reconciliation moment with a Protestant in Dublin. Whoops. Okay, so I've been over quite a lot of ground here. I better wind up. But I certainly think that the intimate ties that bind Ireland, Irish Australia and Aboriginal Australia include paternity, maternity, family and kinship. Australians of Indigenous and Irish ancestry not only literally change the complexion of these ancestral adventures, they also complicate their chronologies, and they make us reimagine the canonical narratives of power. Exiled sons become exiled fathers. They connect distant worlds. Shamrock Aborigines draw strength from the appealing fit of Ireland's enduring histories of colonisation and displacement. Perhaps other people too see them as less threatening because it's an analogy of a faraway kind of oppression, not a close to home that you might have been implicated in yourself. That the once colonised becomes the coloniser and the once Indigenous becomes the non-Indigenous, depending on where you're journeying and where you are. And also the Irish not only became white, but the Irish became black. Thank you.